Cannabis is sin. He's the bug man. He's the master. He's the guru. He's the fucking Dalai Lama. He's the fucking everything when it comes to bugs. So I'm gonna let him go. I'm sure he has stuff he wants to talk about. So we'll just let him go for a while.
Sure. Well, I'm not that important, but I like to think I know a few things. I appreciate the compliments. Well, one thing I thought was interesting that I came across that I've been coming across lately, is all of the weird malformations in cannabis that people are sharing on Instagram and social media, for example. Variegated leaves, or leaves that look very strange, very atypical, things like that, and people are very excited. A lot of people are very excited about these weird and different cannabis cultivars that are coming out, and these weird malformations. And I think some people might not realize that what could be causing them. First of all, can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I think that what's causing that in some cases, in a lot of cases, could be a pathogen. There's not a whole lot of cannabis research about pathogens for obvious reasons. And I know, and you know, you can ask a lot of people. There's tons of pathogens out there that infect other crops that are really cryptic, or they cause these really strange malformations that are very similar. It's very possible that some of these aren't necessarily mutations, but they're caused by a pathogen.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off with that because I think that's a thing that a lot of people are seeing, which is interesting.
And if you guys don't know what he's talking about, he means albinoing on a leaf, one side variation. What are the common ones? I forget all the different names.
Sure. So like what you just mentioned, there's like a variegation. Like sometimes the leaves are like chlorotic, they're albino. There's like white and green, or maybe one half is white of the leaflet, or maybe all of the leaf is white, or something like that. Sometimes you'll see I've seen people post where the pistils are growing out where the petiole, where the leaf stem meets with the leaflets, and there'll be like a pistil and flower kind of growing right there, which is abnormal. There's also the growth, just like kind of flower tissue, reproductive tissue growing out of vegetative tissue, like out of the leaves, just coming out for no reason.
Yeah.
So there's that too.
Yeah. One of the questions, well, I got a bunch of questions, trust me, that I already remember off the top of the head is, I remember me and you talking about, and one of the things that was brought up is cannibalization of predator mites, and predator mites eating predator mites, and what species of predator mites are actually going to eat each other, and maybe eat each other before they go after the root pest that you're looking at.
Sure.
That was a question that was brought up. Is like, okay, what if I put these two mites together, what's stopping them from eating each other?
Right. So, in general, there's a ton of predatory mites out in the market. But in cannabis, for example, the most popular, I would say, for spider mites is Phytocilius persimilis, the red mite people get. And that's a specialist. It won't go after other predatory mites. It'll go after specifically spider mites, which are tetranychids. So you don't have that problem as much. But there are some mites that are more generalists. There's Swirsky and Cucumeris, and those might have some small crossover, but generally speaking, you're not going to see. That's part of the reason why when people are discovering these mites, these organisms for biocontrol, and they're trying to see, well, is this going to be a good match? A lot of times they'll see if they'll do tests to find out, like, will this be compatible with other things? Should we know that? Because when they make it a marketable product and they start rearing them, a lot of times they want to know this information so that when they talk to consumers, they're not going to run into that problem. But yeah, there's definitely like, it's not truthful to say that there's absolutely no what's called intra-guild predator behavior or competition. So like they're both part of the same group, and they're going to eat each other's offspring. But like by and large, it's not going to be a large amount. It's not going to be a huge problem for most people unless you're really putting out a very small population. And if they're hampered for other things, like if you sprayed an application of a pesticide or something or whatever, that's going to obviously affect them. And so if they're already struggling, that might also have an effect, but by and large, you're not gonna have that.
Yeah, like for example, if there's no other food around, obviously they, I don't remember, but I think it was either you or somebody else that brought up even cannibalization with predator mites. They'll actually eat themselves, some of them.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, yeah, like so there's some predatory mites. Just to bring it up again, because I think we talked about it in the last one, but there's different types. There's and I can send this to anyone who's interested, but there's a classification for predatory mites, phytoceid mites particularly. And so it goes from, it's like type 1 to type 4 or 5 or 6. I forget, because there's two classifications, and there's a more recent one, and the additions to the recent one is mostly about what environments they do well in, less about what they eat. Whereas 1 through 4, 1 through 5, I'm forgetting which one exactly, is more of their behavior and what they predate on. And you're right, you can if they're starving, you can definitely have cannibalization in some cases, in a lot of cases. But also, if the mite's a generalist, it's probably going to try out different mites more likely than something that's more of a specialist. Something closer to type 1 is a specialist, something closer to type 4 or 5 is not.
Cool. Can you go over PM? This is the thing, is I get a lot of questions. People want to run UV filters, and they want to run ozone machines, and they want to run all these different types of pretty much expensive pieces of equipment in a room. And I keep trying to tell them that, if you keep a healthy environment and a healthy plant, a lot of this thing, I don't think it's necessarily needed. But can you go over, just drop the PM knowledge on these guys, just please, and explain that a lot of the stuff that is out there, in my opinion at least, is gimmicks, or a product that necessarily isn't going to deal with your situation, or the root cause of why you keep having this repetitive PM over and over and over again.
There's something to be said of the fact that you might not, people might not think of it this way, but they should think about treatment. I just had a conversation with a client, actually, when I do my crop consulting. I had a conversation with somebody who, they were, without going too much into detail, they wanted a treatment plan that was very reactive, but it's really helpful to be proactive when you make your treatment plans. Like you're kind of saying, it shouldn't be about, sure, there are gimmicks as well. People want to sell you things that they say is going to work, or they think that, for example, as long as the plant is at a sufficient level of healthy, however they quantify it, people have different ways of quantifying that. Some people have no ways of quantifying that, which I think is usually a big red flag. Like if you ask them more details, and if they tell you things like, well, you have to have this incredible vast knowledge to understand it, I feel like that's a red flag if you can't really explain it very well in basic terms. But that doesn't always mean that they're wrong. It's just, come on.
Yeah. You should at least know what a healthy plant looks like if you've been doing it long enough.
Right, and you should, sure, there might be a threshold in which a plant is very, very healthy, just strong, and its immune system is good and all that. But it's not going to stop it's not necessarily going to stop an organism from getting in if you clip the plant, or if you accidentally wound it in some way. I think that's an unrealistic expectation for the vast majority of cultivation.
So one of the things that's really popular, and this is where I only do it once, because of what it does. is a term in the cultivation industry they call it plucking or removing fan leaves. They'd add for light penetration in that. Now I do it because I understand the advantage of getting light penetration, but I also do not like doing it because I know I'm actually hurting the plant. Does that make sense? Every time I pluck a leaf off, I open it up. I make it susceptible. Sure. I weaken it, right? If you cut yourself, obviously you're weakening your immune system or whatever. You're weakening yourself. If you cut yourself or something like that happens. As a matter of fact, if you cut yourself really bad, when you go to the hospital, the first thing they're going to do is put you on antibiotics because they know bacteria got into your system and we don't want that to become an infection, so we're going to treat that issue. So, for example, like lollipopping or plucking severely late in a flower or something like that, do you think that could cause these types of things to happen and actually bring on PM because you're stressing that plant?
Not so much for PM.
No.
Specifically.
Okay.
But it's true. It's true. Every time I'm not saying it's wrong or right to do this, but I am saying that every time you wound a plant, you're exposing its circulatory system, its phloem and xylem channels. Yeah. So yeah, and there's a lot of pathogens that require that, but that's how they get vectored, is that they don't have a way of penetrating the plant, but if a bug bites into it and it's traveling through that way, that can happen.
Yeah, that's the other thing is a lot of people I think have PM issues too. They probably, from experience of seeing people have issues, they'll have a pest issue and then PM comes after.
Okay.
For example, they'll have pretty bad mites. They'll spray for the mites. They'll kill the mites. But then 2 weeks later, all of a sudden, they have PM. Do you think that mites can cause the stress where it's more susceptible? Oh, Jesus Christ, I can't even speak. More susceptible. I still can't say it. You know what I mean? Easier to get PM, basically. Susceptible.
Right. I don't think it's incorrect to say that a plant that has been infested with mites will stress, has some level of stress from that. And there's a really great article that, again, I'm willing to send to anyone who's interested. Just remind me of the topic. Where these researchers looked at Tetranychus urticae, the two-spotted spider mite, this wasn't cannabis, but it was on, I think, like some sort of bean plant. And what they were checking to see was what the immune response from the plant was. And what they found that the immune response was delayed. There were like two versions of the immune response, or two like kind of pathways that would happen. But one of them happened immediately when the mice started feeding, and the other one happened much later on. Also, it's important to note that the innate immune system in plants is not adaptive. Not adaptive as an adaptive immune system. What's called an adaptive immune system is,
like,
but like
humans. Yeah.
Like what we have. And what the immune system is capable of for pathogens is different for like pests, for example. And they have and plants have different pathways for that. And so it's definitely it's not inconceivable to say that because you had X pest and the plant kind of mobilized and put physiological resources into helping to avert that, to slow that down, that maybe it took energy that normally wouldn't have used, or that it activated pathways that normally wouldn't, and those pathways that help the one thing might not help or might make them more susceptible to the other thing. But I don't have. There's no
defined evidence. No.
Yeah, not necessarily.
I know how you are. If there's not a study that people have actually proven it, you're not going to say it's right.
Sure. It keeps me from being incorrect on the internet. What a big offense, right?
Exactly.
I hope I don't misspeak anything.
So what was if you were gonna do an IPM schedule for PM, what would it be? If you don't mind, or at least giving some type of.
Sure. Well, I think that I was talking to somebody recently who was kind of lamenting how they asked for a solution to powdery mildew, and the response they get a lot of times is, well, environment is key. And it's like, that's not an answer to my question. That's not a cure. That's just you telling me that I shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Yeah.
You know? I would say that, so depends on the kind of grow. It always depends on your environment and what costs you can accrue and what your resources are. So all of that being equal, which it can't be because outdoor and indoor are very different. But if you're like indoor, for example...
Yeah, let's do indoor. Let's concentrate on indoor.
Sure. So indoor. So it's really important, obviously, to keep your environment, like I just said. I would say that... So powdery mildew, and I think we talked about this last time, kind of the funny thing about powdery mildew is that it's sort of the opposite of botrytis a lot of times. Like the things that help powdery mildew grow will be the opposite for botrytis. So if you're trying to fight the one, you're going to encourage the other sometimes, depending on your grow environment. You can sulfur, for example, is something I like to apply. That I usually recommend for vegetative when you're in vegetative grow, because it's a very old miticide, insecticide. It does have an effect on biocontrols, though, and I'm not saying burning, I'm saying dusting elemental sulfur, because that's usually less of a problem for biocontrol agents in general. But if you're using like a fungus, or if you're trying to have a very like a diverse and vibrant, like biodynamic approach to how you're growing your cannabis, some of that sulfur might be bad for the microbes in your soil. So it's like there's big ecology you have to consider. I like to keep things drier. That sometimes is helpful. Powdery mildew doesn't like actually being wet on contact. In fact, it does require moisture, like all fungi do, and a humidity spike can tell the fungus, hey, this is time for me to get my thing on. So it's not necessarily whether it's dry or humid, it's whether it's dry for a long time. It's kind of like with plants. The seasons change, and the humidity and temperature changes, and that will initiate a physiological response.
Yeah, it's just certain things happen with certain organisms during the spring, they happen in the fall. They know the seasons. So when it's that time, and they know it's that time, that's what they do. That's just what they do.
Right, exactly. So
you're saying PM. So just to recap, because basically PM likes to have if it has a dry climate and it spikes to a humid climate. This is a key or a key way of when PM knows to actually try to take hold. Is what you're saying.
Right. So like if there's spores, for example, those spores will react to that humidity spike, and that's kind of like them. That's kind of telling them. And the season might not have actually changed in real life, but that's their sort of that's their read on the environment.
No, it's true, because anybody that's grown outside for more than 1 or 2 years knows that if you get rain outside and then it's a warm day the next day, it's just like everything activates for fungus, man. It is what it is. It just happens.
Right.
And certain strains are definitely more resistant to it, it seems.
You mean cannabis?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm sure. Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure that this is something that I hope more research comes across for, is that people we start to understand what are the genes that allow cannabis to be tolerant and resistant to powdery mildew, and how we can make that better.
That's the new breeding, man. That's the new breeding, really, in my opinion. It's not necessarily. It's going to be for flavor and all that type of shit too, and how it gets me high or whatever. But a lot of these farmers are going to want to be able to purchase a seed that not necessarily. I'm not saying gene spliced or anything like that.
Sure, not like transgenic organisms, right? But
actually breeding with that plant. Like, I know for a fact cookies and cream damn near won't get it. There's a strain called cookies and cream. It almost won't get PM. I've seen it in a room, okay? PM leaf, cookies and cream leaf sitting on the PM. This plant doesn't have it. This plant is infected like you wouldn't believe. This plant sitting right next to it in the same thing is not infected at all. Wow. So I don't know why it does that.
I mean, like, you know, sometimes we get lucky and we just cross two plants, not even like different, you know, not even different cultivars or whatever, and it works out really well. I know that in traditional agriculture, that is a big deal. Huge deal, right?
That's why I'm on. I'll pull the gorilla into the. That's why I'm on Santo when all these people make so much fucking money. People, I mean, really, when you bring
that's a big part of it.
Good or bad, that's why they make their money, is because you can put a seed out there, you can spray it with a fucking pesticide, and it doesn't even get affected to it. So that's why they're making the money, you know, that they do, and that's why it's so is because farmers love that shit, regardless if it's good or not.
Right, sure, and you know, I'll put my own sort of like controversial cards on the table. Like, I'm not necessarily, I get it. Like there are people. I don't want to be. This will come off, I hope, not pretentious or presumptuous, but like in places where it's literally life or death. You know, these people need the food. They harvest the food. That's all they have. They don't have good access to global food, or it's too costly, or whatever, what have you. I don't think it's necessarily moral to keep them from like having food. Like, you know what I mean? And if these plants allow them to harvest and to actually make food, like that's kind of the situation they're in. And unless we're willing to do other things to help them out, I don't think it's necessarily fair to like rag on people for that. But at the same time, I do think it's legitimate to consider the possibilities. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. No, I agree. You can't hide from the facts. That's the whole deal. Is you can't hide from the facts. So if it is bad for whatever reason, and you can scientifically prove it, then, you know, by all means do it. You just can't run from the facts.
And I think that there's a huge founder effect. And since we're talking about resistance and powdery mildew and things, I think it's really helpful to understand that there are traits that, you know, that bear resistance, that confer resistance to plants, and whether they're transgenic, whether they originally came from another totally different species or not, those are what cause resistance. Those are what allow resistance to occur.
Exactly.
And so, right, and so there's a huge founder effect that happens millennia ago when we started cultivating cannabis as humans, and we didn't necessarily understand. Right, what, you know, we didn't understand how genetics works, right, like we do now. And we don't understand about resistance traits and things like that. So what we selected for in our very first cultivars that became standard, you know, maybe didn't have these traits, unlike their wild types do.
Correct.
So hopefully we can possibly rewild old cannabis population, their genes, into our new genes, and maybe some of those resistance genes that were lost, we don't really know what we're missing out on, that can be helpful.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm on a block mission right now. I'm getting pissed. It's all right. So climate's your number one thing. I mean, is there any? I mean, you don't have to plug a company or whatever, but is there any? I mean, sulfur. I believe. I mean, even plants like sulfur, so it's not even a bad thing to foil with it, really, especially during veg. What about? Is there anything at all besides sulfur you would recommend? Is there any products at all you would like? If you have an infestation, you know, and you're in your mom room and everything's infested, and you don't necessarily want to get rid of all of your genes, or you want to be able to treat that room, say, for example, and make sure that there's no more PM spores in that. How about this? Say you get PM and you're the smart farmer and you're not going to necessarily sell that to anybody. You cut it down and you start over. What would you do to treat that room prior to going and putting plants back in there again?
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of different things you can do. I've heard of people using this. I've never had access to this resource before, but I know somebody up in LA who they would crank up the temperature extremely high, and they would like. Is it 110? I think it's 110 degrees. Something like that. Yeah, it was a pretty high. Yeah, and so I'm not sure if that necessarily is like. I don't think that's like autoclave, like gonna bake everything. Anything that's alive is just gonna be gone. But I think that's a really great way to make sure that a lot of dead material and other things are impacted with that heat. I think they use like a laser, some sort of like laser temperature to like, or a temperature gauge thermometer, kind of like to tell how hot it was. You can also use there's multiple I'm trying to think of the right word, sterilants. There are sterilants that people can wash on the walls and do things like that.
Bleach,
I think the biggest
example, everybody keeps asking for.
Absolutely, right? No reason to get complicated. Bleach is a great example. I think the thing that a lot of people overlook is their own clothes and their own tools. They need to clean those tools, and we need to be diligent about that. I know there are some rose growers that I used to work with that they found that they were getting what's called agrobacterium. They were getting these infections where the agrobacterium would create this giant, like almost like a tumor, a huge gall on their plants, and it would just suck the resources out that they're meant for the roses. And the reason why that would happen was because if the gall touches other plants, then it can transfer. And if you cut the gall off, or if you cut the plants, you can vector that bacterium to other plants. So they would have to.
Hold on 1 second. Genji, pay attention. We're not telling you to spray bleach on plants. Follow along.
Definitely don't do that. If it makes
you can't
anyone
have comprehension,
feel better,
you should just leave the room. You need to be paying attention the whole time, people. All right, go ahead.
If it makes anyone, I appreciate it. If it makes anyone feel better, yeah, don't do that. Absolutely against it, 100%.
Jesus Christ.
But yeah, if people cut, so like that's the thing, is they had to be very diligent, but the staff wasn't diligent, and so they would continue to have these problems. And I get it. It's tough. It's like tough to like. It's menial labor a lot of times, but it's helpful. It's important, and like whether you use a drip irrigation system or you utilize ebb and flow system or whatever, you gotta make sure you maintain your system.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes, yeah.
One of the biggest things I always, every round, wash your AC systems, people. Clean that shit out. Get some simple green. Get in there and fucking blow that shit out every goddamn round, man. Clean it out. Bleach your walls. Mop the floor. Clean everything out. I mean, it's really about cleanliness and then environment. I honestly I gotta knock on wood, because holy shit, if I get hit with it, I've never really had PM issues. Like, I've never had like massive outbreaks with it personally. So I don't have the issue that some people have, is why sometimes I think I always go like, I don't understand how the fuck you get PM so much, you know what I mean? While I deal with fungus gnats all the fucking time, you know what I mean? So it's different strokes for different folks, whatever you want to call it. That's just, I've never had that type of issue. So
right,
these are the things that I do.
Sure, and like the number one thing I think that if somebody should take away from this entire conversation about like powdery mildew and other kinds of bugs and diseases and whether you get it or you don't get it, it's like, at the end of the day, in a field situation, who knows? Sometimes it's really hard to tell, like, what's the proximate reason? And it's really easy to like gaslight yourself and to have other people who are trying to sell you products gaslight you as well.
Oh, exactly. You're like, let's talk about gnats. People are always, and I want to know about gnats. What? Because I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but I can tell you, every soil that I have ever bought, it seems like, that sits in some type of yard or sits somewhere, comes with gnats. You know what I mean?
It wouldn't be surprising.
No, I would. I don't need a study. I bought enough bags of soil and opened them up and had them fly in my nose and shit. You know what I mean? There's no study needed.
Sure. Right.
So, fungus gnats. What would you do to deal with those in an indoor environment? as a preventative or something, they pop up, how would you treat them? With, the thing I don't like is everybody goes, well, you just root drench cedar oil or whatever, and I've always had problems with it.
What problems did you have with it?
It seems like the plants don't like it.
Okay.
Plants just get upset, and I don't know if it's a pH thing that it does to the soil, or something of that nature that necessarily they don't. But what would you, as a all organic, you can use up to day of harvest or whatever. What would you do to treat that type of stuff?
Well, fungus gnats, there are a lot of treatments for fungus gnats, and there's a lot of for people who really, like myself, really care about having options for people who want to do biodynamic work and work with a soil medium. Not that that's a be-all, end-all, but for people who want, who don't want to use a bunch of chemicals and things, there's actually a lot of options for fungus gnats, I'm happy to say, unlike powdery mildew. So there's I'll go down the list off the top of my head. There's my favorite product, Beauveria bassiana, which is an entomopathogenic fungus. You can drench it, you can root dip, you can leaf dip with it in a spore suspension. There are multiple species of predatory nematodes. The problem, however, is that predatory nematodes are less effective with smaller targets, smaller hosts. And what I mean is, well, rather, it's not that they're less effective, it's that they're less persistent in the medium. So the bigger their host, like a big giant like beetle grub that's like 2 inches or 3 inches long, that thing is going to have they're going to be able to reproduce and make a whole bunch of themselves. But in a small little larva, not so much. It doesn't mean they won't kill it. They'll just, it's just that you might have to put more and more frequently to have your, or put way more in the beginning or something like that to sort of compensate for that. But that works out. That works well.
It's the overkill. It's the shotgun technique. It's overkill. We just put so much in there that it's just, there's obviously not going to be anything left. That's kind of idea with how I'm with the predator mites. I overkill my predator mites.
Yeah, and like some people have the money and the resources, or their grow is small enough or big enough where that works out, and some people can't. But you're right, like that's definitely it's a legitimate strategy.
Okay, so they want to. Everybody's asking, what was the first one you just said? The fungus dip or whatever?
Oh, the Beauveria bassiana. Yeah,
Beauveria bassiana. People, get that. Say that fucking 5 times fast. Sorry,
right.
That's
no. You're right. It's and so that's products that are like that. I'm going to try to be. I think Botanigard is one. Mycotrol is another. And there's a few others, I think. A few others, like isolates of Beauveria bassiana on the market.
What was the first one? Botanicare?
Botanigard.
Botanigard, people.
Yeah, Botanigard. Not guard like it should be spelled, but Gard.
Now, what he's telling you is a product that has a active ingredient in it that is a fungus, right?
That's correct. And what you're getting is the spores. So when you spray it, whether you drench it or you dip your roots into it, the spores are what cause the. They're kind of like they're a pathogen for your pests. For the fungus gnat. What are they? Larvae.
What's the middle? Larvae.
Yeah. Yeah, and yep, and so that can be helpful. Hypoaspis miles, or what's the other genus that people work that with? I'm forgetting off the top of my head. That entire group taxonomically requires some reorganization. Just to, so I don't really keep up on. I try to, but it's really hard sometimes to keep up on the different genera, and people shouldn't feel, it's complicated even for people who have to do it every day. So
no, it changes all the time too. So I think you mentioned this to me, or somebody. I'm almost positive you mentioned this to me. That we know of, like as growers, we know of broad mite, we know of russet mite, we know of spider mite. These are the big 3 that we know of because this is what we can see.
Sure.
Or that we are aware of that will actually affect a crop to the point where we want to worry about it, if that makes sense. But I've also been told, I think it was you, that there are other mites as well that will just are a natural mite to a plant per se, or maybe even just a natural pest that you can have in your garden that you're not even aware of that's there. Was that you that told me that? Like, there's a lot of pests that we may not even know that we have.
Oh, like a cryptic thing, like a cryptic pest or a cryptic pathogen?
Yeah, well, you talked about the pathogen, but what about pests? I mean, we know of broad russet spider mites. Are there any other pests that you know of that actually feed on cannabis, or that we would be dealing with on a, or are those dead? I mean, you know what I mean?
I think so. Well, like, you mean like things that? Do you mean pests that exist but are not apparent?
Yeah, like leaf hoppers, for example. I mean, do you want to go over some other types of pests that would naturally just be outside? Thrips, for example.
Right.
I have leaf hoppers outside, so that's why I brought them up. I have them around, so.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen. Okay, so like maybe some like.
Here's another one, root aphids, because let's do root aphids, because I have a bunch of fucking DMs about these people too.
Sure.
Root aphids. How do you deal with them indoors, for example?
Sure. Again, that especially with root aphids, that's going to depend on your setup a lot. So indoor setup, maybe a hydroponic setup, let's say.
Yeah.
Sure.
If Envy's not in here, he's going to get his ass kicked. So go ahead.
So, again, I like Bouveria bassiana for the root aphids. Predatory nematodes are also helpful. I would say that if you're dealing with root aphids, some of the things that you can do might not be biological. Some of the things that you can do to prevent them or to treat them can be as simple as having. Of course, it's going to depend on like how big is your infestation and all these other factors. But you can also try to do things. I have not personally done this, but I've heard of people having some success with diatomaceous earth, spreading it on on soil. Yeah, DE. I've never done that myself, but I know people who have had success. So that's a little hearsay. But have you ever heard of people using that effectively?
No.
No, you've not. Okay, so let's take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. I've heard of it working, but maybe that only worked in a soil system rather than a hydro system.
Yeah.
There are... Yeah, I tend to like to use entomopathogenic fungi like Bouveria bassiana. There are other products, however, that can be effective that are biological. I'm trying to think of the name. Metahirizia, something or other. Yeah, I want to say that's a fungal pathogen as well that you could also use in the soil.
Interesting.
But sometimes the best thing, even for myself, I get hung up on the bios because that's usually where I specialize in. But like laying out sticky traps can help cull a lot of the adult population that are apterous, that have wings. So those are forms of aphids that are of the same species of aphid that are going to go on to infect other plants, presumably your own crop. So trying to find ways to limit their exposure to other plants. Sometimes the best thing to do as well is if you think you only have it on one plant, just get rid of that plant. But if it's a plant that you can't afford to get rid of, you have to make a tough choice.
Yeah. Well, I'm a firm believer of culling a plant too. If my first 2 weeks when I'm vegging, if I see any plant that just looks like it's sickly or doesn't look like it's going to do what it's going to do, it immediately gets replaced. I mean, I don't know how. Like when I take clones, for example, if I need 9 clones, I'm taking 18 clones because I want the healthiest ones out of the bunch. Do you see what I'm saying? So and I'm a firm believer when you put your plants in, keep a couple extra plants. Sometimes when you transplant a plant, it just is not happy. It didn't like whatever the fuck you did. It doesn't matter. The point is you have a backup. You're like a spare
Right.
freaking tire.
Well, and another big thing that I think a lot of people overlook, partly by necessity, is a quarantine protocol. Like, don't, especially in this era of cannabis cultivation, where a lot of people are not. There's no UC extension that I can go to get help with this stuff. There's no government. Obviously, there's not a lot of government help.
Yeah.
Like that other people can utilize, and so a lot of times you're getting your clones and you're getting your seeds and you're getting your plant material from other people, other vendors, and it's just very prudent. It's not insulting. I'm not trying to insult anyone or say that like nurseries are bad or anything like that. It's just common sense in pretty much every other cultivation industry. No reason for it not to be here. Quarantine your plants if you can.
Yeah. Well, and exactly. If you get a new cut, let's put it like this. I got a cut from somebody. It sat on a different side of the room and got sprayed every day, for a week and a half before I even thought about even bringing it close to anything. You know what I mean? It is what it is, bro. The guy says, well, why'd you dip it? Hey, I don't know what the fuck you have, pimp. It's nothing against you. It's just like when you go around, you shake a bunch of people's hands. You're at a big party, right? You shake a bunch of people's hands. You go take a dump. You wipe your asshole. The first thing you do is you wash your fucking hands, people. It's just what you do. It's
Right.
And so when you're bringing around these types of things, you wash that plant. You take care of that issue. You just don't deal with it. If you wash your fucking hands, you don't got to worry about getting sick all the time. It's just what it is. It's the same analogy. It really is.
It's all about it's hygiene. It's called hygiene.
Exactly.
It's plant hygiene. It's people hygiene. It's the same thing. Yep.
Exactly. There's no difference. There is literally no difference.
Yeah, because it's the same concept. It's the same kind of way that pathogens are getting into our bodies. That pathogens vector. It's just how they do it.
Yeah. What were the other white flies? I don't care about. If you got white flies, in my opinion, you got some weirder issue.
Well, I don't mind going over it for the people who have it.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Talk about white flies. Somebody was asking about white flies.
Yeah, sure. So whitefly, right? Typical whitefly species.
Hold on, one second.
Okay.
Puffin house grass. I'm a firm believer of pyganic. People can call me I'm a fucking idiot and it's not organic or whatever. There's like research out there now saying that even certain strains of cannabis are producing pyrethrins.
Oh, we could talk about that afterwards.
I would love. Matter of fact, you can go over that now, please, because I'd love to know your opinion on pyrethrins, how to use them successfully, and if you should use them.
Right. So pyrethrin is a compound. Pyrethrins are a class of compounds that, for people who aren't in the know, because only the know or whatever that hashtag is, right?
Yeah.
Anyways,
only the know.
Right. Pyrethrins are a class of compounds, typically isolated from chrysanthemum, the flower.
Typically.
And,
This is the key word, people. Typically. So they're around in a lot of plants, right?
Not my understanding until somebody actually corrected me was that they were only in. Well, okay, I say that because
I heard in high amounts that you can actually extract, and it makes sense to fucking pull them out of. Is why they use that flower.
Well, I only say it because taxonomically, chrysanthemum used to be part of another genus entirely, and most of those and a lot of those plants, not most, but a lot of those plants produce pyrethrin, if I remember correctly. So that's kind of part of why they were grouped together, or at least that was a trait that they kind of all were associated with, at least. But yeah, by and large, it's really only chrysanthemum. And there's a couple of different species of chrysanthemum, so, I mean, depending on how, pedantic I want to get, right? But, anyways, yeah. But you're right. So, right. I thought that it was only chrysanthemum that ever produced pyrethrins, besides artificial, development of pyrethrins, right? And somebody showed me the same, I'm sure it's the same research report you were mentioning here, where a group of researchers were able to find a pyrethrin compound, or a pyrethrin-like compound, based on I want to say it was some sort of spectrometry that when they weigh the molecules, and that's how they can figure out maybe what it is, or using light. It didn't match necessarily the same pyrethrins that we were normally used to seeing in like chrysanthemum and other kinds of extracts. And they didn't apply anything to these plants, and they grew them from seed and all this other sort of thing. So it's not, so like the implication strongly is that those particular plants they were growing were producing pyrethrins endogenously. And the other
we're talking small amounts, people. We're talking parts per billion, I think it was.
Yeah, it was actually quite small. And if I remember correctly, it was very, very small. And the other really interesting thing is that I think they were able to isolate part of what made it so controversial was that they were also isolating the gene families that were responsible for pyrethrin production.
Okay.
So it really, really heavily implies that at least in that particular group, there was pyrethrins being produced. How much that can be generalized to other plants, in cannabis or otherwise, is unclear. And it's also I don't know. I think it's really important to consider the fact that and I think I made a post about this recently. Like, there's a ton of plants that we eat for food that we normally consider as safe, but is it? We just people drink alcohol all the time, and a long time ago, and even now it's poison. It's poisonous, but we've adapted because the human ancestry in certain places did that so much that we would become able to. We've evolved to process it better, but only through exposure and mutation and.
He's talking about you drunk ass Irishmen, for example, people.
Sure.
I'm just kidding.
Well, it probably happened way before that, So
exactly.
But it's tomatoes. Okay, so Solanaceae, your tobacco, your tomato, your pepper, your capsicum peppers, and your eggplant, and all of that stuff. All of those plants, they have compounds in them. So they're wild compounds. Back before we cultivated them out, they had poisonous toxins, and they still do. Don't go and eat that's the nightshade family. Don't go and eat the leaves. It's going to be a bad time, But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, us selecting out the toxic ones and making the fruit bigger and all this stuff made the plants that used to be really resistant to herbivory by us and by pests are now not. And
yeah,
so
they get ate up if you put them outside.
Right, and so it's better for us because we can eat them, but it's also worse for us because the pests can get to them better. So it's a balancing act, and so I'm not necessarily saying that. I guess what I'm really trying to articulate is that just because it's in a food that we normally eat doesn't mean that it's good for you or bad for you. But it's consider that the dose makes the poison, right? We're all the time. We're underneath the sun. The sun is not good for your skin.
Yeah, it's UV all day long. So would you recommend or not recommend a product like Pyganic?
I tend to not recommend Pyganic, but not because it's necessarily bad. It's just that usually in my experience, if people are trying to use biocontrol agents, I don't recommend using a pyrethrin because it's typically quite insecticidal, and there's a lot of biocontrols that are sensitive to that.
But say for example, this guy sorry, Puffin Housegrass, but he's asking because I do it. I'll be honest, I spray it. But I spray it as a cleaner, for example. I know I'm killing everything on the plant, for example. I know that's my intention behind it, is I don't want anything on it.
Right, then, in that case.
Yeah, and then I wait basically 14 days, and then I release predators as a cleanup crew or as a preventative in my flower room, but I don't spray anything in my flower room. For example, I'll take cuts. Okay. My cuts go into a 6x6 inch cube, basically two weeks after they get cut, and then they veg for 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, I'll spray them 3 times with pyganic, and then from there they go into my flower room. And then in the flower room, 1 week after I put them into my flower room, I release predator mites and sachets or satchels or whatever the fuck you want to call them. And then I don't spray anything for the entire flower cycle.
Okay.
So that's how I'm getting. You, right? Yeah. So that's how I'm getting away with it. And I was having, matter of fact, me and Lau were talking about this. He doesn't spray anything anymore. He's just releasing mites in his veg room too now. It's just I come from a sprayer background, like bio sprays and all that. I sprayed what the fuck is it? Venerate. I sprayed Grandivo. All these different types of biological sprays. But I don't like inert ingredients, right? So that's why I stopped spraying anything in the flower room. I don't mind people that spray that shit in veg or whatever. I'm just a firm believer of once that thing starts putting flowers on its, and you're going to be inhaling that shit. Don't be spraying anything on it.
I feel that way about right, and I want to say just in case I didn't make it really clear before, I also feel that way about sulfur. I recommend sulfur for like veg, but
veg
not flower.
Yeah, it shouldn't be in the flower room at all. I mean, I had to use it in flower, and I wouldn't. If you get russets in week 2 of flower and your whole room's going to die, and you have to spray sulfur, you're going to be okay. But as soon as you see any type of actual trichome production or any type of actual pistils showing, you cannot spray sulfur anymore. I don't care what people say. You will taste it in the product, and if you extract it, it will be even worse.
I feel similarly. I think that, sulfur is pretty, dusting sulfur, right? It's going to get in your trichomes pretty easily.
Oh, dude, immediately. It smells like dog farts, bro. It's horrible. You know what I mean? It's just, It is what it is. But it works, too. It really does. I mean, it kicks russets in the dirt, boy. It messes them off. It really does.
The sulfur.
Oh, my God. I mean, it eliminates those suckers.
And you've also found that when you use like pyganic, for example, or a pyrethrin, you don't really have pest issues going forward after you do that. That system seems to be quite solid for you.
Very solid. I can't find a mite in my room. Not at all. Not at all. Well, I can't find anything. You know,
that makes sense.
And when I've sprayed in the past, you know, it always just seems like I'm killing 98% of them. I'm killing 99% of them. You know, and even if you continuously spray, I'm spraying for 3 weeks, you're really not killing them all. You think you are. There's 3 or 4 of them that are still there, and then you stop spraying, and then 2 weeks goes by, and then, God damn it, if you don't have the son of a bitches again. You know, it's because you really never killed them. You really never got rid of them. And that's, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions. And that's why I'm a firm believer of those predator mites, is because they'll find mites that lay eggs in PVC pipes. Like, the mites don't give a shit if it's on the plant or not. They're looking for mites.
Right. Well,
they're on the pots. They're in the soil. I found predator mites crawling all over the place. They're seeking to destroy little things. Yeah, you know, they're and I think that's the biggest problem, is that when people are spraying, they're spraying that plant. They're not noticing that I've seen spider mite eggs that'll lay underneath the pot, on the side of the pot, in the PVC, on the trellis. Really? Oh my God, yes. They're creative little son of a bitches.
I've actually never seen that. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
No, it happens. And they know this because they're adapting. They know you're spraying this whole plant. You're spraying
or maybe you're forcing them to do it too because of what you're saying, your treatments.
They know it's always wet there. They can't lay my eggs there.
Well, I actually think it's a really good topic that you just brought up about never really necessarily killing them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the biggest thing.
Right. Well, I'd like to say this, that sometimes, let's say a product is being tested, right, and it goes through all the rigmarole that needs to go through, and it's effective, whatever. Okay. So they find that in trials it's effective, in field trials it's effective, in lab trials it's effective. But that doesn't mean that, me or some other person applying the compound is going to get 100% contact. If it's a contact kill only, if it's like an oil, right? If it's a horticulture oil that kills by suffocation, you have to make contact. And that's where it kind of, that's where there's a
Kush,
degree.
hold on 1 second. Kush 12. Bro, we're not growing in a 3x3 tent. We're talking about people that have millions of dollars in greenhouses and shit. They're not just killing it all. You're an idiot. Just shut up. You don't just kill a whole fucking 1,600-foot greenhouses. That's not what happens in cultivation, pimp. We're not in a 3x3 tent. We're talking about major ass ag shit. Thanks. You can't just kill off a fucking farm. Sorry.
Right, yeah. Well, that's kind of part of what I'm talking about, is that, like, people in in agriculture, not cannabis, but, like, that's kind of why people feel so, sometimes they feel so helpless that they have to use certain compounds or they have to use certain pesticides, because it's like life and death. They'll either lose their farm, or they go and use black magic to, like, kill their, and it's not necessarily healthy or what's on the label. Like, that's how that happens. I think it's really important that people don't, it's kind of like bullying, or I guess it's kind of like, I don't know, like, if you know somebody's doing wrong, it's like honey is better than a stick. You know, you just try to be understanding that farming is a hard job. Cultivation of plants is difficult, primarily because in human history, a lot of the things that are important for a good harvest are out of your control. Sunlight.
You can't control shit. I mean, your shit gets rained on. What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? Control the weather? Pray to whatever deity you believe in?
There are certain farmers that do pray to God for good weather. I'm sure it happens, you know?
Oh, that's part of their, I hope
that's
it
part
works.
of their IPM is every night I pray to God that the fucking mites don't get me. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Part of my IPM, people.
Right. And, you know, and it's like, I don't know, maybe I have a different perspective from other people from my background, but I feel like it's really helpful, it's really not helpful that, you know, people are so, kind of like some of the people you were kind of mentioning in the comments below, kind of like people who might not get that a commercial setting is incredibly stressful, or they might get it, but they just haven't lived it, so it's hard to empathize on that level.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't own a farm. I don't own a farm. I don't own a huge cultivation farm, so, like,
these guys don't understand. It's like even 100-foot greenhouse. If you have 100 pounds of weed in there,
right,
you times that by $1,000, people. That's $100,000. They're not just going to go rip it all out. You know, they can cut out sections. There's shit that they still can do to try to save some fucking money. I mean, people got to eat.
Right. Yeah, and you know, maybe they have the resources to do that once. Like,
yeah, it doesn't mean that it's not. That doesn't mean that I'm advocating going in there and spraying Avid all over the goddamn thing, or as
right,
whatever the fucking active ingredient is in all those. I'm just saying, there's ways of dealing with certain things.
It's like I'll look at it like this. It's like a chemical dependency, like heroin. And I don't necessarily get upset at the heroin user for getting addicted.
We're out of here in 10 seconds, by the way, guys. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, like, comment, subscribe, check out my YouTube, I guess. That's what you're supposed to say at the end, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll keep it.